I'm originally from Mexico City, and I started playing guitar and music with my family, and then I moved to the States. And I really arrived to ethnomusicology, as many of my colleagues do, kind of by accident, because I was studying music, and I met Dale Olson at Florida State University, and he said to me, the discipline could use somebody like you know, who is from the culture, and you can, if you like this music, wouldn't you like to know more about the music? I was like, yeah, I didn't think about that. Coming from Mexico, if you want to study music, you study either kind of Western art music. Back then, I don't know how much now, but back then, studying the music that I was playing, which is trios and boleros, is not something that you study at the university level. So that opportunity to study that music at the university level is what attracted me, and he invited me to be part of the ethnomusicology program at Florida State, and that's how I arrived into it. Once I learned more about, the goals of ethnomusicology, I was like, yes, this is what I want to do. Music, culture, anthropology, sociology, you name it. It was the convergence of all these ideas that attracted me. Like many of my colleagues, this idea of providing cultural understanding through music is something very attractive. Now, in my own teaching, when people ask me, what do you teach? And do you teach music of Africa, music of the Middle East? And I always respond that what I teach is tolerance through music. And that's what I do with my students. And that's part of what I believe the goals of ethnomusicology are today, that you can take a musical tradition and, yes, show the instruments and show the history and show the performers, but underneath, you have the opportunity to tell students, like, there's a social issue, there's something to be addressed. Well, your question is where I attended grad school, but if you allow me, I'm going to reframe it a little bit in terms of how was my education towards becoming an ethnomusicologist. And I would say first, again, growing up in the culture, like playing with my uncles and seeing my grandfather play, that was part of my initial education into the study of the music. Now, in terms of graduate studies, I was very lucky to attend 2 universities. So I went for my undergrad and for my master's at Florida State University with Dale Olson. And then I got a job at the Smithsonian with Dan Sheehy. And I'm putting that on the list because I also consider that as part of my education. Working for the Smithsonian, it was like an extension of graduate studies. The work I did there, it was very informative, and it expanded my vision of what I had already learned at Florida State. And after the Smithsonian, I went to UCLA and studied with Tim Taylor and Steve Loza. So I was very fortunate, very lucky to have, obviously, my personal background as somebody growing up in Mexico, then the academic program at Florida State University, then the experience at the Smithsonian, and then the PhD at UCLA. How that impacted my career? Well, I got teaching techniques from different people. I got views from different people. I play in ensembles, like play in the salsa ensemble in Florida State, in the ensemble at Florida State. I was the director of the Mexican Music Ensemble at Florida State, and then at UCLA I was part of the Middle Eastern Ensemble, the Bluegrass Ensemble. So I had the opportunity to play with Dale Olson and Indian music, and with Jihad Razi, Middle Eastern music. I feel very lucky. And I told my students that too. It's great that you have one university goal and one university that can provide you that. But if you can try different ones, you get a broader view. It's natural that if you talk to other scholars, you get more points of view, than I think is very enriching. So my main research projects, I wrote a dissertation on bolero, and eventually realized that what I'm more interested in doing is see the implications of bolero, but in the trio style. So I mostly research sentimental music in the trio style from the 1940s and 50s, and its eventual reinterpretation across national borders and across different time periods. So I interview some of the founding members of Trio Los Diamantes, Trio Los Panchos, Trio Los Tres Reyes, and that has been a great experience. And I have done some of that work here in the United States. I interviewed some people in California and some people in San Antonio. So part of my research is kind of moving away from very nationalistic approaches of like, oh, this music, well, actually, that happens a lot, right? This music is from this specific area. I think our discipline has been moving towards a more broader spectrum than a regional approach, which I celebrate and I'm part of it. I do that, but I'm also very interested in career development and what's going to be the next turn in the discipline. So I have a book project right now with Oxford University Press entitled Beyond the Field. We might change the title, but so far it's a working title of Beyond the Field, Pathways in Public-Facing Ethnomusicology, and where we are talking precisely about different career opportunities. The paradigm where you go to a university to study ethnomusicology in hopes of becoming a professor is great, but it might not work for everybody, and there might not be jobs for everybody. That doesn't mean that ethnomusicology doesn't have relevance outside of that. So I'm interested in seeing what are the connections of ethnomusicology and marketing, or ethnomusicology and the private industry. How can we as an ethnomusicologist expand the purview or the traditional purview of ethnomusicology in a way that will provide students the opportunity to learn how to advise companies like any company, Microsoft, or how to be more responsible in the use of music, for example, in advertisement, have to be more responsible with the use of music in movie making. Countless are the times, and I think this probably happens to a lot of ethnomusicologists, when you're watching a movie and you're like, that is not from Mexico, right? Like you're listening to it. And I'm thinking of a series where, you hear a charango and these people are supposed to be in Mexico, and it's like, no, I mean, they didn't take the time to talk to an ethnomusicologist. And part of it is because I think we as a discipline, we're also not putting ourselves out there. Like, this is something that we could do for you. So that's another part of what I do in terms of research and scholarship. We theorize a lot about power, how power affects and capitalism and the structures of power, but we don't learn how to work within the structures of power to make our discipline a sustainable discipline. And I think that has to change. And to respond to your question, the first step is to remove any stigma, so we can then start establishing the mechanisms in place, the work groups, the panels, the initiatives, and say, like, okay, since we're ready to take that step, right? Let's start the conversation, and from there, I think we will be able to work out the logistics on how to put ourselves out there. But if we don't remove the stigma, and or I don't want to say the stigma, but that kind of sense of, oh, you're doing that, we're not going to be able to put ourselves out there. One of the things that I really liked when I was in graduate school, well, first of all, was this invitation from Delos and saying, the discipline could use somebody like you. And I was like, oh, I feel honored. Thanks so much. But then reading, there's a quote from Clifford Kurtz that I really like, that he says something along the lines that, it's not about them asking to our deepest questions. It's more about us listening to the questions that they have formulated themselves. And those kind of lines really, really get me, because when we are talking about people like me and others who are, well, in my case, coming to a different country, learning a different language, learning the ways of how the academic language works, you are in a way effectively distributing power to those who don't have that power. So, and that was one of the purposes. When we're talking about these things, we're really talking about the structures of power that have been in place for the longest time. Now, that is not to say that it comes without any nuances. And somebody asked me this not that long ago. In what way, and I think kind of goes a little bit with what you're asking, in what way now you're different from somebody who's not from Mexico going back to Mexico, now that you're trained in the U.S., that you have this life. And I think it's fair, and I think what I responded is that the fact that you might be from the community, that doesn't exclude you from issues that you have to pay attention to. I personally wouldn't feel comfortable going to Mexico and doing, let's say, work in the Mayan community. When I go to the Yucatan Peninsula, I'm as foreigner as anybody else. So the voice that I bring, and if you see most of my research, I usually start with a paragraph or something that says like, when I was 15 years old, or when I was here. Because I try to always relate or research on something that I experience. It makes me feel comfortable, but it also makes me feel that I'm sharing something that not only I read on the books, but I live. I teach a class in Latin American Studies in my university, and I tell my students when I'm talking about all this crisis and stuff, many of these things I tell them like, I didn't read about it, I lived through it. 1982, the crisis, I was there, right? Or I tell them like, oh, my mom did this, or my dad this, and I think my students appreciate to take my Latin American Studies class because, you know, I bring a lot of my personal experience into what they're reading. That is not to say that somebody from a different culture cannot do that. I think a foreigner or somebody who's not from the culture bring a different perspective to it. Somebody who's not from there in a way brings a nuance. Like, okay, I will accept that my own background or subjectivity might cloud some of the things that I'm seeing. So I think there's space for everything. But like what I mentioned before, the distribution of power on letting people from the culture speak for themselves is something that I appreciate and I value. Right now, some of my highlights are teaching students who, you know, they approach me and they get excited about what they're learning. And, you know, many of them tell me, like, and I have it in some evaluations, they say, like, I'm a more tolerant person because of this class. Like, I can see, I didn't know this. When I start my classes, one of the things I ask is like, what kind of music you like and what kind of music you don't like. And depending where I'm teaching, you know, I will get hands like, I don't like country or I don't like this. And I show them that those judgments usually come attached with some kind of dismissal, not to the music, but to the people. And so I work, it's like polishing something constantly. But at the end, many of my students, they really appreciate that tolerance that they develop towards the people through the music. And those are gains that I get constantly when I'm teaching. So in terms of teaching, every time I do that, and every time, if I touch one student, you know, if I have, and I'm in a very unique position because I teach in Arizona. I'm from Mexico. I have an accent. And I'm supposed to teach cultural understanding. Oh, and I teach in Trump's era. So many of my students come from very conservative places where they have seen or they have learned that Mexicans are not trustworthy. And then they have a Mexican professor in front of them. So it's a challenge. But, you know, it's also an opportunity. When I think about it, you know, I get up every morning thinking I have the opportunity to show that student, you know, to touch that student, so that student can go back home and be like, yeah, it's not like that. One of the things that I encourage very much is critical thinking. That is crucial for me, for my teaching, you know, to develop critical thinking. And I tell them, you have to put it on the grill everything you hear, including myself. If I say something that you might not agree with, I celebrate that. You have to put that into the critical thinking. If I get you to disagree with me because you're critiquing what I'm saying, I succeeded. And they appreciate that, and I appreciate that. So those are some of my gains. In terms of my going to other parts of my career, I enjoy very much my work at the Smithsonian. I had the opportunity to produce, I founded the Folkways magazine, which now has From the Field and From the Archive. So I did that back in 2009. And it has been great. It was a great experience soliciting content and making online features that will impact potentially the entire world through the internet. I produced an album of trio music with Los Tres Reyes at Smithsonian Folkways, and I produced a couple of online features. I will also add to that all the colleagues and friends that I have done along the life. I mean, this becomes a family, and we're all moved very much by the same issues that moves us and that concerns us. I would say that for the most part, we're all one kind of like the same thing. We're all outraged by racism or by classism, and I think that's the inner engine working and always in the society. So when you go to graduate school or when you work in an ethnomusicological setting, or when you come to one of these conferences, you meet somebody. Yeah, you can be talking about what research you do or whatever, but underneath, we all have this like, yeah, we all wish that we can do make the better a little bit, the world a little bit better through music. Well, as a society, SEM is an annual meeting that reinvigorizes us all. It might have its ups and downs, and you might like some things and you might not like. I mean, that is normal. But I think at the end, we all get excited about what we're doing and what somebody else is doing. So it's an intellectual feast. It's an intellectual feast, and in many ways, when you have been coming for a long time, it's also a fraternal feast, because you see all these people that you like. Some of them were your classmates, some of them were your students, some of them were your mentors, and you see them over and over. You remind yourself that you are doing this career and that you are very lucky. I walk with friends and I think like we are very lucky. We're very lucky to have this meeting. We're very lucky to do what we do. And we are in a crucial moment where what we do is no less important than what it was 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago.